this video, we're going to be discussing how we can import a few different file types into Microsoft Access. We're going to be starting by taking a look at XML. So switching over to the desktop in Notepad++ here, I have patientlist.xml, and this was a list of patients that we want to import into our Microsoft Access database. And it contains things like patient's name, phone number, address, who their doctor is by ID to the doctor in the doctor's table, as well as a list of medications they've been prescribed, including their medication name, dosage, instructions like that. It also has a little link here, a foreign key, to the patient that it's been prescribed. We also have patient list schema.xsd, which is a specification for that XML file. So it defines what elements are valid, the names of those elements, the order, if they're complex, if they're simple, and if they're simple, what type of data they store.
One thing we have to keep an eye out for is this last update attribute in the medications element. This is the attribute we are using to keep track of the date the medications list was last updated. When importing XML into Access, attributes are a bit of a problem, as they're not imported by default. So let's keep that in mind, and we will come back to this in a little bit.
So up here we have our doctor's office database, and the main table we're going to be concerned about right now is the doctor's table. Right now we have two records for Dr. Bob Bob and Dr. Alice Alice, and they have IDs 1 and 2. So before we import the data, one thing we want to check is if these primary key IDs are matching up with the foreign key IDs in our XML. So the doctor ID is supposed to be the link, so we can see that the first patient has doctor ID of 1, that's a valid entry. Second patient has a doctor ID of 2, that's valid too, it's listed in our doctor table. And the third patient has a doctor ID of 1, and that's also valid. So what is important to make sure that those actually exist, because once we import them, we don't want to have sort of entries that are broken. They don't have correct links. So in this case, it looks fine. So we can start going into the import step. To actually import data into our database, we go to the External Data tab. So if you're on Home, it would look like this. Then you click on External Data. Click on New Data Source from File. And in this example, we're going to be dealing with XML. If you're dealing with a text file, you click on Text. If you're dealing with an Excel file, you click on Excel. In this case, we're dealing with XML, so we click XML. And it's going to be asking us, where's your XML document? The important thing is that your XML document and your XML schema are in the same folder. The reason for that is, if you recall, we added a little thing in our XML document that said that I'm using a schema, and this is the file name for that schema. In this case, it says patientlistschema.xsd. So that's assuming that it's going to be in the same folder. So they have to be in the same folder when we're importing them into Microsoft Access. In this case, they're going to be on our desktop. It's only going to list XML files right now because it knows we're looking for XML. In our case, it's called patientlist.xml. And we hit OK, and it's going to give us a list of what it's going to import. So at this point, if you didn't have that schema file or it wasn't in the right folder, you'd probably get an error popping up. So it is important that we have both the schema and the XML and that they're valid. So before we even do this, we had to check if those XML documents were valid. If you're confused about how you do that, make sure you watch those XML example tutorial and the schema example tutorial. Both of those are videos that you can watch on YouTube by clicking on the owl links or looking at the CS1032 playlist. So what we're seeing right now is basically what it's going to import from this XML. And we see two tables, patient and medication. That's a good sign because those are the two things we want to import. If we click on the plus, it's going to tell us the names of each of the fields that are going to be put in these tables. So it's going to make a patient table. It's going to give it a field card num. It's going to give it a patient number, phone number, address, doctor ID, birth date. And for the medication table, it's going to add medication name, dosage, instructions, days, patient card number. So if you're being really aware, you might notice that one thing is missing.
And that thing is the last update attribute in the medications element. As I mentioned, Access is not going to import any attributes by default. In most cases, this won't be too much of a problem, as if we're following best practices, we should only be using attributes to store metadata, they shouldn't actually be storing any data we need to import. In this case, we will lose last update in the data stored here. But in this case, we don't really need it for our purposes. If we did want that, we would have to structure our XML document a bit differently, such as making a simple element that stores the last update date instead of it being an attribute.
So we're going to continue. We have a few options here. We could import structure only. This means it would create the tables with the fields in it for us, but it wouldn't import any data. We have the option which we probably want, structure and data. So that means it's going to make the tables and import the data. Or we have append data to an existing table. So we'd use this option if we already had the tables created and we just wanted to put the data in. We didn't want to make the structure. But since we don't have these tables yet and we want to import the data, we're going with structure and data. Click OK. And it's going to ask us if we want to save these import steps in case we want to repeat them. In this case, we're not really going to be doing that, so we don't have to click save. We just hit close. So it doesn't mean if it wants to save the data, just want to save the steps we took to make this easier later, but this is a one-time operation, so we're just going to hit close. And you can see it added two new tables, medications and patient. So it did import them and we can see the data here, but it's not going to be perfect. So we're going to take a look at a few things. We'll start with the medication table. So we can see they have medication names, they look okay. We have dosages, they look okay as well. And we can just make this a little bit wider so we can see everything. We have the instructions, it's imported the symbols correctly. Remember we had to escape that symbol before. We have even the patient card numbers. So everything looks okay in terms of data, but we should take a closer look in the design view. So one thing we'll notice is this table doesn't have a primary key. But that's not a big issue. We don't have to have a primary key for every table, but it could make things a bit easier. We do have patient card number, which is going to be our foreign key that links it to patient. If we wanted to be really strict, we could always add like a medication ID, but we don't need it in this case, so we're not going to mess with it too much. So we have the medication name, and it's done short text, which is good because we said that we want it to be a string in our schema. We have dosage, which is set as a number. And we can see the field size is set to decimal, which is good because we said dosage should be a decimal number. Then you can have sort of decimal points. Instructions are short text, also good. So at this point we might want to do things like change the maximum field size. Maybe we don't want a medication name to be that large, so maybe we might limit it to like 60 characters. Instructions we might want to leave large so the doctors can type in longer notes. Days, that says it's a number, but notice, oops. So days, it says it's a number, but notice that it set it to decimal. So sometimes it doesn't always get it right. Remember in our schema, we said this should be an integer, but it didn't make it an integer, it made it a decimal. So Access isn't always perfect when it imports data, so sometimes we have to make a few small corrections. So in this case, we're going to switch this from decimal to integer, because that's what we wanted. And we'll look at patient number and card number. So one thing we're going to have to make sure is patient card number, whatever we change here, we also are going to have to change it in the patient table because it should be the exact same because it's a foreign key. For now, we're just not going to touch it. We could do things like make an input mask or set the length to be a little bit more accurate just because we know that there's a strict format to health card records, but we're not going to do that right now. One thing we should do is set the required and allowed zero length for everything. So it's pretty good at guessing what should be required when we import it. So medication names have been set to required, but it does allow zero length strings, so empty strings. So we don't really want that, so I'm going to say no. It says index no, that would make it unique. We don't want to do that. It says dosage is required, that's true. Instructions are required, but it allows zero length. So we're going to say no, because we always saw that they were required, and that's what we said in our schema. Days, we have integer, required yes, so that's good. We have patient card number, required yes, but we don't want it to have zero length, so we'll set it to no. So we've got to do a little bit of cleaning to the table. Should we save that? It's going to give us a warning because we changed things, but this shouldn't actually affect the data. Yep, we'll just keep it. So the data is still there, everything's still good. now we have to do the same thing for the patient table. Take a look at it here. We have a card number. Probably a bit long, but we're not going to mess with it too much. We don't want to allow 0 length. Don't want to allow 0 length again. We do want to maybe make the patient name a little bit smaller, 60 characters. So phone number was an interesting one. Remember, not all patients had to have a phone number, and Access has detected this correctly, and it says required no. But we probably don't want 0 length one still. Address. So we could also do other things to phone number, like put in input mask, field size. Depends how detailed you want to be. Address, required 0 length. Let's say no. Doctor ID. We'll come back to that later. Birth date. Required yes. No. And you'll see that it actually made birth date correctly as the date of time. So I left a few issues in here, and we'll get back to those in a sec. Again, we can save it. It's not going to be an issue. The one last thing we want to do to the patient table right now is rename it, because right now it's just using the lowercase naming convention. We want to use our naming convention that we've been using for Access and our ER diagrams, where the object entities have all uppercase. So to do that, we have to close out the patient table, and we right-click on it over here, and we click Rename. So now we can retype these letters in uppercase. So that renamed the table, and it's important that it's closed when you do that, or you'll get an error. So the next step is going to be setting up the relationships. So we go to Database Tools, click on Relationships. We can see the relationships that we already had set up for this example. See that the new tables that we imported aren't listed yet, the medication or patient. So to show them, we click on Show Tables. We click on Patient and click Add, and we click on Medication and we click Add. So in the same way we set up the relationships from before, we're going to have to do that with our new tables. The first one we might want to set up is patient and doctor. But we potentially sort of overlooked something. So we'll see what happens when we try to go between doctor ID and this doctor ID. So the foreign key and this key. So in theory, it should work. Those doctor IDs were in our database. We saw that it was imported as a number. Well, let's see what happens. Doctor ID to doctor ID. We're going to click Enforce Referential Integrity. That means we're going to enforce this relationship. Everything should work. It's saying the right type of relationship. Let's see what happens when we hit create. We get an error saying the relationship must be on the same number of fields and with the same data type. So what this error is saying is that it means the foreign key in our patient table, this field doctor ID, isn't the same data type, or it isn't the same field size or something like that as the primary key in the doctor's table. So let's investigate. So let's close. Save that for now. So in the doctor's table, take a look at the design view. The primary key is doctor's ID. The field size is long integer, and that's pretty much all there is to it. Let's look at our patient table. Doctor ID was set up as number, which was correct, but it set it to decimal, which is a bit odd because even in our schema, we said this is an integer, but Access didn't import it correctly. So it's important to check each field in the tables you import and make sure that the field sizes, the data types, and all that is correct. So in this case, we're going to have to set this to long integer. Integer wouldn't work because when in our doctor's table, it said that it was long integer. So the foreign keys, like we've mentioned before, have to use the same field size. They have to use the same data type as the primary key. So we make sure those match. So we save this. Close it, and let's get back into that relationship editor. So now we drag doctor ID to the doctor ID, one-to-many, it's doctor ID and doctor ID, and we click Enforce Referential Integrity. And this time that works fine because we fixed that issue with the field size. So there's one more relationship we should set up here, and we can also just move these around to make them look a bit nicer. Like that. And that relationship is between medication and patient. So you'll see that medication has the patient card number, and patient has card number. And this is why it was important that we added that in the XML document, so we'd actually have a foreign key to link to it here. We can try to link it and see what happens. We have patient card number here. Drag it over to card number. Like that. That's not a good sign. It says indeterminate. We click enforce referential integrity. Let's see what happens. We got an error. No unique index found or reference field of the primary table. That's a bit of a confusing error, but maybe if we take a look at the medication table, we can see what we did wrong. So we'll save what we have for now. Open up the medication table and go to design view. So we have medication name. That's just some text. We have dosage, just number, instructions, short number, days, number, patient card number. So this is our foreign key. Short text, field size 255. Should be the same in the other table, but what's going on here? Maybe the error isn't in this table. Maybe it's in the patient table. Take a look here. We have card number, same field size, same type, but we're still getting an error. So what you might want to try is pause the video, see if you can figure it out. If you've been following along, you can try a few things, see if you can fix it, and then unpause when you think you know the answer, or you just want to get the solution because you can't figure it out yet. So there is something that this table is lacking that we need, and that is what card number is. Remember, card number is unique. It's always different for each patient, and it's going to be used as our primary key. But we haven't denoted that. Remember, we have to hit this button up here when we have a field highlighted to say that it is the primary key. So now that we've done that, Access will know that that's the primary key. And a big clue that this was an issue when we went to the relationship view is that it didn't have this little key symbol beside card num. Now that we've added it, it has the symbol, and this relationship should work. So now instead of indeterminate, it says one-to-many. We get both on both sides. We can enforce and hit create, and it worked okay. So those two errors that I intentionally put in were some examples of stuff that you might get in your own assignment, and that's how you can fix them. The names will be different and how everything will be slightly different, but it'll be the same sort of ideas. We need to go through the fields after we import them, make sure the field sizes and things like that are set correctly, and we have to make sure that we have primary keys added where we need them. Note we don't have a primary key for medication because we don't have anything linking to it like that. We could go in and add like a medication ID or something like that, but it's not necessary at this point, at least until we're trying to do something more complex. So I'm going to save this database as it is now and have that available for you on OWL. And we'll be moving into our next example of importing text. So I'll switch back to the slides. So now we're going to talk about importing text into Microsoft Access. So by text, we mean plain text, text that doesn't have any formatting to it in terms of like bold, colors, things like that. Something you'd make in like Notepad++ rather than something you'd make in Microsoft Word or Excel. So when we're talking about text, at least when talking about text being imported into Microsoft Access, we're usually talking about one of these three formats. And these formats aren't quite as strict as XML. They don't have like a strict specification or a validator to check them. Rather, they're sort of loose standards that have sort of evolved over time, sort of ways people tend to format data, but not sort of evolving with strict rules. So the first one is space-separated values. We'll take a look at each one of these, so don't worry too much if you don't quite understand when I'm just explaining it. So with space-separated values, this is something you'd probably just do naturally if you're working in Notepad++ and you wanted to enter some data that would go into your database. So by this, we mean that all the columns are sort of separated by a number of spaces, so they all sort of line up nicely in the file. By tab-separated values, we mean that each row in the file is going to represent a row in your table or a record in your table, and all of the values, the different column values, are going to be separated by tabs. Comma-separated values is the same idea, except we're going to be separating the data by commas instead of tabs. So the big difference here is in the space-separated format, that could be any number of spaces between those different field values. So here it's more like they're being aligned to denote that they're in different columns. While in the tab-separated and comma-separated, we say that they're delimited in that there's a certain character, and tab-separated be the tab character, and comma-separated be the comma character, that denotes that this is the end of one field's value and the start of the next. So let's take a look at some of those. So what I'm showing on the screen right now is an example of a space-separated text file. In this case, we have a number of students, we have some dates, and presumably this is when they took a test, and this is the grade they got on the test. So the only thing that's separating these are just spaces. So this would be like something someone would type into a text editor, where they just manually hit the space key until everything's sort of lined up nicely. So you can see here I've highlighted the spaces with alternating yellow and green, and those are all individual space characters. The big thing to note is there isn't necessarily the same number of spaces each time. So in this case we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 space characters. Here we might have like 4 space characters or so. So this number of space characters between each value, like the date and the name, is going to be different because we're trying to make it line up. It's also important to note that this header up here, so I have like descriptive text up here, like this is the date, this is the pupil, this is the grade. This is optional in a lot of these text formats. So sometimes you'll be given the headers or the field names, or you can call them the column names, and sometimes you won't. It depends on how the text was formatted. So once this text gets into your database, it should be separated like this. So you'd have 3 fields, date, pupil, and grade, and you would have 4 records. So let's look at the tab separated value example. So this one looks a little bit confusing. Nothing seems to be sort of aligned. That's because the goal with this format isn't to align the text visually, but to separate it with a tab character. So between each one of these values, someone actually hit the tab key on their keyboard. So each green space doesn't represent a bunch of space characters, rather it represents the tab key being pressed. And since we only care about there being a tab or not, it doesn't necessarily line up everything nicely. You can see how these headers are going way off over here, while the data is a little bit closer together. So this is less of a human readable format and more of a computer readable format, because it's really easy for the computer to tell there's tabs there, but visually looking at it for a human, it's a bit hard to see how the data lines up. Once again, the header fields are optional, and when we import this into our database, we should get, I believe it's 5 columns. Each one of these would be the fields, and we should have, I believe it's 5 rows or 5 records. So the comma separated value example shown right here is for a bunch of cars, their make, model, and description, year, and price. So presumably this would be for sort of like used car sales. So in this case, we're using comma separated value notation. So that means instead of tabs, we're going to use the comma character. So I've highlighted all the commas here. One important thing to note in this sort of formatting is you'll see that 2 of these commas here aren't highlighted. That's because they have quotes around them, these double quotes. So this sort of denotes that this is a string, one value that should be in this one description field. So when things are surrounded by quotes, it means that they're sort of escaped. These don't count as separating a field value. You can also see down here where we have sort of double quotes. What this means is that we're escaping sort of the actual quotes, because we want quotes in our actual field value. So that might be a bit confusing now, but let's take a look at what this should look like once it's in the database. So here you can see that the AC, BS, ABS, and Moon has those commas actually in the value in the field. And then these model numbers or model names down here, the double quotes are preserved. The reason why they're preserved, if we look back, is there's already double quotes around this. Plus we have like double quote. So if you wanted to keep a quote, you'd have to go like quote, 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 quote. Your idea is that we're sort of escaping those special characters using quotes. So let's take a look at how this actually works for Microsoft Access. So we're switching over to the desktop, and I have a file up here called nurses.txt. This file is also available on OWL, so you can take a look at it. And one of the first things you should do once you're getting some data to import, you should actually open it up in like Notepad++ if it's a text file, and take a look at the data to try to figure out which one of those formats it is. So one easy way to do that in Notepad++, this will be a bit different if you're using brackets, is you go View, and you go down to Show Symbols, and select All Characters. So what this is doing is it turns white space, like spaces and tabs, into different symbols, so we can sort of see the structure of the file a bit better. So it might be a bit hard to see. Let's see if I can zoom it in a bit. So you can see there's these little dots, and those represents a normal space like you'd hit with your keyboard. These CR and LF at the back represent two special characters called line feed and cartridge return, and that represents just a line break. It means we're going down to the next line. We don't really have to worry about those right now. But what we do have to worry about are these spaces. So we can see we have a different amount of spaces between each field, and they're basically being lined up. So this would be an example of that space separated format, that first one we saw, where someone's manually gone in and spaced out all these fields so that they sort of line up nicely. And the data we're looking at in this case are some new nurses to add to our nurses table in that doctor's example that we saw before. So the first field here, or the first column, would be the nurse ID. That would be the primary key for this table. This would be the nurse's last name, and this would be the nurse's first name. See that this one, Alexander, has a little nickname added, so that should be part of this field. So this is part of their first name. We then have the doctor ID that they're assigned to. So these are valid doctors already in our database. Remember, we have 2 doctors with an ID 1 and 2. And this is the hours worked. In this case, it is an optional value, so one of the nurses doesn't have a value. So if we were to look into our database and the nurses table, we can see we already have a few nurses in here. We got Alice Nurse and Joe Blogs. So we want to import these nurses into our existing table. And the way we do that is very similar to the way we imported XML. We go to the External Data tab, we click on New Data Sources, go from File, except in this case we aren't going to select XML file, we're going to select text file. And this text file will work for any of those 3 formats we saw: the space separated, the tab separated, and the comma separated. So first we select where this file is. In my case, it's going to be on the desktop. And you'll notice it's only showing certain file types. So it's only going to show text, CSV, tab, and ASC. In this case, the file we want is nurses.txt. We click Open. So now we have a few choices. We have import the source data into a new table in the current database. So this would import sort of like we did with the XML, where it actually creates new tables. But in this case, that's not what we want to do. We want to import this data into an existing table. Second option is append a copy of the records to the table, and lets us select a table here. So in this case, we want to import the data into the nurses table. So we select nurses. So use the first option if you want to create new tables, and click the second option if you want to import this data into an existing table. Click OK. So this is an important choice. And it's going to depend on how your text file is formatted. So we have delimited and we have fixed width. So with delimited, it means that we have data where each field is separated by some sort of character. So that could be like a comma character, it could be the tab character, or it could be any other single character. So with tab separated values and comma separated values, we're going to want to select delimited. But in our case, we want to select fixed width. This is when we've used spaces to sort of align everything visually. And that's the file we're working with right now. So that's what we're going to select. This little preview window here shows you the data that's in the file and tells you how many lines there are that it's found. So we click Next since we have fixed width selected. And it shows you sort of graphically how it's going to chop up the file. So each one of these lines, or each one of these columns, represents a column that's going to be in the database. Usually Access does a pretty good job, assuming the format was done correctly. But but it does sometimes have issues. So one issue we can see here is one of these lines is through Alexander and Alex. So this should be just one first name. That's their nickname, but it all goes in the first name field. So right now it's detecting this as a new field, and that's going to be a problem if we try to import this because our table doesn't have like a nickname field. So to fix this, we can just click the line, and it removes it. If it didn't detect a field, you could also add in a line to say like if this was part of the first name and that was part of the last name. But it did it correctly, so we're not going to add any extra ones. So you want to make sure there's a line at each point in the file where the actual new field starts. You can see these numbers up here, and that's sort of the character number on that line. So with these fixed width formats, since we're spacing them out by characters, each field should always be starting on a set line. So the last name always starts on around line 10. I think it's line 9 here. The doctor ID always starts on line 41, and so on. So once we have all these lines set up correctly, and usually it'll be pretty easy because Access is going to do a good job of drawing them, we just click Next. Now it's going to ask you the table we're importing into. It's going to be nurse. That's okay. And we're just going to hit Finish. And if everything went correctly, we should see this screen. If there's any issues, there might have been errors in the formatting, a screen will pop up and ask, are you sure you want to do this? And it'll say some of the data might not be able to be imported. And it'll also give you sort of like an error report. So we hit Close. And if we look back in our nurses table, we can see that the new nurses have been added. We just have to make this a bit wider so we can see everything. And we can see that Alex, the nickname, is part of the first name like we intended. So that worked correctly. So we can take a look at the next case. And this is going to be nurses.tab. Again, this file is provided for you on OWL. In this case, we have a few more nurses we want to import, but the file is formatted a bit differently. So again, on Notepad++, I'm showing these characters. What this would look like without the special characters, just if you're normally looking at it, would be something like this. So it doesn't look like it's lined up correctly. That's because we're using tabs instead of like a set number of spaces. So I'm going to turn that on again. So that's Edit or View, Show Symbol, Show All Characters. And this lets us see sort of those invisible characters. In Notepad++, the tabs are represented by sort of orange arrows. We can see there's a tab between each one of these field values. Also in this case, it's a bit different because we now have a header for this file that shows us the different field names. So we've got nurse ID, we got their last name, got their first name, which sort of goes like this. We've got doctor ID, which goes down like that, and we have hours per week. Again, because this isn't a fixed width file, it's not one of those space separated files, everything's not going to line up. Instead, they're just separated by tabs. So this is more of a computer readable file than a human readable one. So again, we want to import these new nurses into our nurses database. So we again go to External Data tab, New Data Source, From File, and again we select Text File. So even though it's a .tab file, it's still going to use it as text. So we're still importing as text, even though the file extension is different. And that's fine because tab is one of these options down here. So it's going to be showing .tab files. So we select on nurses.tab, not .text this time. Click Open. And I should point out that the file extension for these text formats doesn't actually matter. It could be .text, it could be .tab, and if you're on like a Mac system or a Linux system, it could even not have a file extension. So once again, we are going to want to import this into the nurses table. Oh, and if you get an error like this, what it's saying is the nurses table is currently open. So we have to close that table before we can go on and add data to it. So we just click yes, and it will close it for us. That's if we want to save any changes, I'll hit yes. And in the background, it closed the table, and it's gone to the next step. And that next step is we have to pick if this is delimited or if it's fixed width. So since this is tab separated value, that's one of the delimited types of formats, we're going to select that. Again, that means it's spaced out by a single character. So it could be a tab character, it could be a comma character, it could be any other kind of character. It just means they're not manually spaced out. So not every single field is going to start on the same character number. So now Access is going to try to guess which type of character it's delimited by. In this case, it's guessed correctly that it's tab. If it didn't guess correctly and we were like over here with comma, and the data is not all nicely lined up, you just have to select the correct character. So if the correct character isn't available, like right now it has tab, semicolon, comma, space, if it was something else, you just click other, and then you type it in right there. It has to be a single character. In this case, it's tab, and that's the first option, and it will draw the lines for us. So in this case, we can't move the lines around because it's not starting at a fixed spot in the file. Instead, it's just detecting where the tabs are in the file and drawing the lines for each column at that point. So if it's not drawing the lines at the right spot, that means you either have the wrong type of field selected. For example, if we selected like space, you could see something weird like that. Or if we even did like other at the number 1, it would do weird things like this because those aren't the correct character. We want to make sure tab is selected. The other thing is we're going to want to make sure that we denote that it has a header. So remember in our last example there was no header, in this one there is. So if we were just to go next and try to import it, it would think this first record here was actually values to be put into the database. Like their nurse's ID was actually the text nurse ID, or their doctor ID was actually the text doctor ID. This would cause a problem because those wouldn't be valid for those fields. So to tell it that the first row contains the field's names, we just click on this box right here. And I'll show it up like this, and that way we won't try to import those as actual values. Click next. It says it's going to import to the nurse table. Click finish. Everything went okay. Okay, close. And we can take a look at the nurses table. And now we have some new records that came right from that file. So it looks like everything went okay in this case. So the last text example is a little bit more complicated. In this case, we have what's called a comma separated value file, and it ends in .csv, which is the file extension some people use for comma separated values, but you also might see it in .txt and a few other ways. In this case, we have an inventory list for our doctor's database. This is going to be sort of like the inventory of supplies they have on hand in the doctor's office. In this case, we're going to want to import this as a new table, and it's in a bit of a new format. Remember, this is the one where each one of these commas represent a new field. So we do have a header at the top to help explain it to us. So we have item ID, we have name, we have cost, and we have count. So the way we know when we're in a new field is when we hit a comma. So we hit 1, so that's going to be the item ID, comma, so that means we're going to the next field. It's going to be name. In this case, it's called Band-Aids. We hit a comma, so we're going to the next field. It's going to be cost, so it's $5.25, comma, and then we have count, which is how many they have in stock in this case, and it's going to be 32. So that's how we read the file, but how do we import it into Microsoft Access? So once again, we're going to be in the External Data tab. We go New Data Sources, from File, Text again. We select the file. In this case, it's going to be inventory.csv. One interesting thing to note is if you have Excel installed, it might be trying to open this file type for you. So it says inventory.csv here, and it looks like an Excel file. So Excel can process the CSV files, but they are still plain text files. They don't have any special formatting, they don't have formulas or anything like that. It's just this raw text that we see here. Even though you can open them up in Excel, they're still plain text files. But we're not doing that right now, we're just selecting the file. In this case, instead of clicking on append a copy of the records to the table, we're going to say import the source data into a new table in the current database. So we're saying that this data represents a new table, and we're going to import that structure, and we're going to import those data fields. So one problem we're going to run into, and this is one of the reasons why XML is such a better candidate for this, is we have very little information about what this table is going to look like in that file. In fact, all we have are the field names. So we're going to have to provide a lot of more information. In our XML example, we didn't have to do that. The reason why is because that schema that we provided with it actually filled in a lot of that information. Told it what the data types were, the name of the fields, what was required, what wasn't. We're not going to have that in this case. We just have raw names. So let's see what happens. Okay. So once again, this is delimited because it's delimited by a comma character. And Access is detecting it correctly. It's putting the columns right where the commas are. And again, we have to say the first row contains field names. So it sort of deals with that header for us. Now there's one more issue. If we look at this file, some of these item names have quotes around them, sort of to denote that this is one word with the space in it. But we don't want these quotes imported as text, so we're going to have to use a text qualifier. So we set that, and we have a few options: none, a single quote, or a double quote. So when we select double quote, it's going to remove them because it knows it's being used to escape things, like in that example that we saw before. So make sure you have the double quote selected for text qualifier. If you have double quotes, that sort of mean this is a string. So now, because we don't have any information about what those fields actually mean, Access is going to ask us what each one is, the data type, if it's required or not, and if it's indexed and stuff like that. So the first one that it couldn't figure out on its own is item ID. So it's going to ask, what data type is this? And it's guessing long integer. That's probably fine. We could have a ton of items in our database, so we'll leave it like that. It says duplicates are okay. That's fine. Actually, this probably will need to be changed eventually when we set it up, because item ID is going to be our primary key. So we could leave it like it is now and then fix it when we make it primary key, or we could just fix it right now and say no duplicates. Next field is the name, and we're saying short text. That's fine. Cost, in this case it's saying it's going to be a currency. Again, that's fine. And count, so it says long integer. So we might not want to go with long integer. I mean, it would work fine, it's still a whole number, but that does go up quite high, so we might be wasting a bit of space. We're probably not going to have any count that's that high. So we could probably just switch this to a normal integer value. And if we wanted to skip one of these fields, we didn't want to import it, we'd click this button right here. After we've clicked on each one and looked over the different data types, click Next. And now it's asking us about the primary key. So do you want Access to add one? You can see it's adding an ID over here. Or do we want to choose one of these fields to be primary key? So in this case, item ID is the primary key. So we want to choose our own primary key. And we select the field, in this case item ID, and then Access will set that up as the primary ID field. Click Next, asking us the name of the table. So if we want to follow our naming conventions, we'd probably want to make this all uppercase. So we're going to hit Finish. We're going to hit Close. It's created a new table called Inventory. And we can see we have our data. But just like when we imported the XML, it might not set this up perfectly. So we do want to go into the design view and take a look at all the field types. So we have item ID. It's been set up as a number. So depending on how we're going to use this database, we might want to change this to auto number. But you would have to remove the data and reset it up. So we'll leave it as number for now. Can look at how it's formatted, long integer, it's required, it has to be unique, so that's all fine. For name, it is quite a large field size, so we might shrink that down a bit. It says it's not required, which is a problem because we want all our items to have a name. And it says it's allowing 0 length strings, which we don't want. So we're going to go to cost, set it up as a currency, and as far as we know, that's required. Again, it's hard to tell because unlike XML, this doesn't come with a nice schema that tells us exactly what's required or what isn't. So we're going to assume everything's required, but Access didn't assume that, so we have to change that on all of these. So count is a number, it's an integer. I want to say it is required. So there, we made our changes. Yep. That's just saying we are changing the field so we could lose data if this sort of violates, or any of the data we have right now violates those rules, but it shouldn't, so we can take a look. See everything's still there. Just spread it out a bit. So our inventory table has been imported. We fixed all the fields up, and it should be good to go. And save. So we're going to switch back to the slides. And we're going to cover our last topic in terms of importing data into Access, and that is importing Excel workbooks. So this one is much easier, and I'll just open up the Excel file I have. because we've already worked with Excel for a bit, so we should be familiar with the format. In this case, I just have a sort of table here. It doesn't have much formatting on it. It just has one bold list up here. It's got basically some records that represent appointments for the doctor's office. So what we're trying to do in this case is we want to import these values, these records, and we want to set up an appointments table. This appointment table is going to list a doctor. It's going to be the doctor who the appointment's for, and it's going to list patients by their card number. Remember, we saw the card number in that XML example. Those would be the primary key for the patient's table. This would be the primary key for the doctor's table. So these would be foreign keys for our new appointments table. This one links it to the doctor. This one links it to the patient number. The subject is what the meeting or appointment's about. We have a reschedule field here that's going to say if their secretary should reschedule this. The doctor's noted that they can't make it, or the patient's noted that they can't make it, so it needs to be rescheduled. And we have the length of the meeting. So there's a few notes about the data. So the dates are all in the date time format. So they give both the date and then they give the time in one field. Doctor's IDs are the integers. Patients are strings. Subject's going to be a string. This is sort of a true or false, a Boolean value, if it's going to be rescheduled or not. And then we have a small integer number here. That's whether it's how many decimal places it has we're talking about. In this case, no decimal places because it's a whole number. So we want to import this into Access. And it's fairly straightforward. We go external data, new data source, from file. And this time we're not selecting text or XML. We select Excel. Go browse, desktop, select the appointments, workbook. And in this case, we're saying we want to import it into a new table because we're trying to create a table here. And it doesn't access too many questions to start with because it knows how the Excel file format's formatted. And you also notice that it found the cells on its own, so we didn't have to tell it where that range was. So if you had more data all over the place in your Excel file, it could get a bit confused. So you do have to make sure the sheet is fairly clear. In this case, it was fairly straightforward because we just had this one list of rows and columns, and it was smart enough to crop it down. It's also smart enough to detect that the first row contains column headers. If it didn't, you just have to click this. And that's just like what we saw before, like whether that first row is just field names or if it's actual values. In this case, it is the field names. You'll notice that the date and time got formatted a bit differently. And that's because in Excel, we have this display as date and time, but underneath in the file, it's actually storing it as a number. It's just changing how it's displayed. So that's perfectly fine. We'll see that once we get that imported, Access will store it like that, but it will display it correctly. So let's keep going. So again, unlike the XML, which has that schema that really describes each one of those fields nicely, Excel doesn't really describe the fields in the same way. It might be a bit better than a text file, but it doesn't say what's required, what isn't required. It doesn't really be too explicit about the data type. So we're going to have to give it a few hints. So the first case, we have date and time. First problem is the field name, date/time. We probably don't want a slash character in our field name. So we're going to remove that. So it allows us to rename the field. You can see the data type, it's date with time, so it got that correct. And then click on Doctor ID. You can see that it says Doctor ID, and here's actually a bit of a problem. This we saw in the XML example too. Sometimes Access imports integers as doubles, which doesn't seem like it would be a big problem, but when we start trying to set up relationships between tables, if the Doctor ID foreign key is formatted as a double in this table, but as an integer in the doctor table, we're going to get errors. It's not going to allow it to work in the terms of the relationship manager, because foreign keys always have to have the same field size and data type as the primary key in the other table. So instead of double, we're going to switch this to long integer. The reason why we're going with long integer is that's because that's what Doctor ID is set up as in the Doctor ID table. So for patient card number, it's already set up correctly, short text. For subject, again, it's set up correctly as short text. For rescheduled, so Access doesn't have a Boolean type. Instead of it has a yes and no type. So those are equivalent, so that's fine. It's going to turn each one of those true and falses to yes and no's. And for length, we have one issue, which is that we have brackets here. We probably don't want that in our field name, so we're just going to remove that. And again, it's detected this as a double when we want this to be an integer. In this case, we're not going to have two big lengths, so we're probably just going to set that as integer instead of long integer. Hit next. Now it's asking us about the primary key. So we can see in this file we don't have a clear primary key. We could maybe make a composite key out of like doctor ID and patient card number, but the problem would be then we wouldn't be able to have like a second appointment. Doctors will be able to have a single appointment with one particular patient. They could never have a second appointment with that patient. So unless we wanted to cobble something together, like making a composite key out of like the time, the doctor ID, the primary card number, we don't really have a clear primary key. So in this case, we're going to want to add that sort of surrogate key, and we're going to do that by letting access add the primary key. So we just have that first option selected, and we can see here that access is making a new field called ID, and it's just sort of automatically numbering the records in order. So click next. Rename this to follow the all capitals. And click Finish. It worked okay, so we're going to hit Close, and we see a new Appointments table pop up. So you might open it up and go, oh no, what's this? That could be an error, maybe something didn't import right. But remember, those hash lines, just like in Excel, means the column just isn't wide enough to see everything. So we can just pull it over. Or you could like double click to make it wider automatically. So it looks like all the data is here. Notice that some things have been formatting differently, even though they have the same value, like the dates are formatted differently, and true and false is turned into no and yes. That's fine, it's the same data, we're just visualizing it differently. So let's go into Design View and see how everything was set up. So the first thing we might want to change is the name of the ID field. Access just called it ID. Maybe we want to be a little bit more clear. Appointment ID. And set it up as an auto number and a long integer. That should be fine. We have a date time. It's a date time type. So this is the format. Now we're just going to leave it as a general date because that shows both the date and the time. So again, it didn't set the required fields. So in this case, I think all the fields are required. At least we can assume that. So we're going to switch them all to yes. So that's required. Doctor ID, large integer. It's going to be required. The appointment has to be for a doctor. Patient card number. So this field size is probably way too big, but we'll just leave it at that for now. Going to be required. The doctor has to be meeting with someone. We don't want it to be 0 length. Subject. So this one could be optional, but we'll leave it as required just because we didn't see any examples where it wasn't filled in. Schedule, yes, no. So there's not much set for that. It's either a yes or a no. And we have length. I say that's an integer, that's good. We want it to be required. All the appointments should have a length. Okay, so it looks like we're good. So we'll save. Save. Make sure the data is still okay in there. Looks fine. So now we have to do the harder step, which is setting up the relationship. Because this appointment table that we added does reference other tables. It's not like the inventory table, which was just sort of on its own. So we make sure all of the tables are closed. We go to the database tool, we select relationships, and this is what we currently have set up. We're going to want to show another table, which is appointment. Click add. So we have the appointment table here, and we have to link it to two other tables. We have to link it to the doctor table, and we have to link it to the nurse table. So we drag doctor ID to doctor ID. Force. Drag patient card number to patient card number. And force. And we hit create. So now we have this appointment table here. And just move this around to make it a little bit easier to read. So now we're all done with this appointment table. We've imported its structure, set it up a little bit, and imported the data. So I will save a copy of this database with everything imported, the XML patient, the XML medication, the new nurses from those text files, and the appointments from the Excel file. So you can find that now on OWL. So if you're interested in creating this yourself, you could give it a try. You might want to try following the steps, so you're sure with how you can import things. So thank you for watching, and have a great day.